Our research was really to start a frank and an open discussion on this and to bring a bit some evidence back to Brussels that, African governments are not being taken advantage of by China. And they do see it as a sort of win-win situation to be able to pick and choose what the EU and China bring in terms of assets in the different countries.
We saw also just earlier this year, there was a fantastic photo posted on the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania's X feed welcoming the Chinese ambassador and some of her colleagues to dinner. And they said, thank you very much for having a wonderful dinner together. This is what diplomats are supposed to do. They're supposed to have these engagements.
I also feel that if we had a more open discussion, then Europe could also look at how to improve its own offer. One of the key points we hear from partner countries is this idea of the slow delivery of Europe and the quick delivery of China. This is something that the EU Commission, I understand, wants to invest more going forward. And can we learn from China in that space as well? So there are a number of spaces where Europe could actually learn more about China and also use that knowledge to reflect on itself.
That speaks a lot about how sometimes those projects are designed in an office somewhere in Brussels or Washington, D.C. without really taking into account the agency of African countries, because there is also that sense Africa don't have agency, Africans, they don't know what they're doing. So we have to provide them with the tools to better understand what they're up against, and we are there to help them to do so. And this is where I think they're going to keep on failing and failing badly.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Synergies podcast network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Géraud, joining us, as always, from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to you, Géraud.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Listen, we've had a long week thinking about U.S.-China-Africa relations. We talked about that last week on the show. This week, we're going to shift our attention to Europe. And this is a conversation I feel that we've had for a number of years. Europe has been seeking to restart its relationship with Africa. It's been trying to kind of get it off the ground. There's been this feeling in a lot of European capitals that even though historically, oftentimes through awful kind of historical context, the relationship between Europe and Africa was the primary foreign relationship that African countries had with the world. That changed, obviously, dramatically at the end of colonialism and then later on at the end of the Cold War. And then the Chinese kind of come into the picture. And there's this anxiety in many parts of Europe about what their role is. And this is compounded by the immigration crisis that now is changing the politics in Europe and their relationship with many countries on the African continent. You, Géraud, recently had a chance to participate in a fascinating discussion with the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM. They issued a new report, The EU and China in the Global South, Perspectives from African Countries, where a lot of these questions came up about the future of Europe-Africa relations, particularly in the context of China. Tell us a little bit more about some of the key themes that came up in that discussion.
It was really interesting to have those discussions among scholars and expert analysis coming from Europe, from China, from Africa, really visiting the reports and the conclusion and thinking ahead of what cooperation would look like. Because this is one of the main points of the report, is advocating for the needs of moving away from geopolitical competition and maybe exploring the perspective of cooperation. Because somehow for so long we got caught up into that framework, especially under the Global Gateway and the BRI, that, there's no cooperation possible. So it was really that gathering, having all those people sitting together, looking through the report and thinking about what can we do? How can we move forward? Is it a space of cooperation? And the views are really interesting, because I remember during this conversation, people raising the question, for example, of Europe foreign policy autonomy when they deal with China, and comments were in the sense of is there any real serious political will from Europeans to move away from a US worldview perspective perspective to consider the possibility of China, a cooperation with China on the green transition project in Africa, on critical mineral space in Africa, because there is that sense of like, if Europe is enabled to have that China cooperation in Africa, it's because of the US. There is a sense of like, is Europe understanding what makes China attractive for many African countries, what EU can actually learn from China to adapt itself, to learn how to move away and how to win back African hearts in that space. And there was also, of course, views of like, we don't need cooperation because Africa doesn't really need a EU-China cooperation, because cooperation also means that Africa is losing the leverage of winning the best of both sides. But sometimes a good competition, maybe a fierce, difficult competition and the rivalry might be a good thing for Africa. But now the worries was like, is African countries are set to deal with the complexities that comes with either a fierce competition or a collaboration? Because at the end, if cooperation needs to happen in Africa, it needs to happen on Africa's term, on Africa agenda, and it needs to be an Africa-led initiative, Africa-led agenda to be able to have cooperation on the continent that benefits Africa. And that's not just happening between EU for the EU advantage or for China advantage, because the reality is we are talking about that EU-China cooperation only because EU needs access to critical minerals in Africa. If it was about accessing EU market or trade issues they had with China, they can easily solve the problem through bilateral agreements, EU-China, they solve the problem. But if we are starting to talk about Africa, it's because there is Africa in terms of natural resources and how that cooperation is going to benefit African countries. That is the big questions that we have to answer.
Now, in this discussion that you had with ECDPM, did the question of the West come up? Because a lot of times people will talk about the West as if it's some unified force, that Europe, the United States, they're 100% aligned. They comprise the West. Or some people will talk about the global West. We talk about the global South. They'll talk about the global West. That includes Australia, New Zealand, Canada, even Japan as a Western country in terms of aligning with other G7 countries. But, you know, I guess when I look at it, I see some pretty stark differences in the approaches of the European governments and the European Union with that of the U.S. Did you pick up on any of that in the discussion with ECDM people?
At the end, we had that feeling that was Europe and the West was a kind of now all together, especially when you have now the Mineral Security Partnership, where they strengthen and reinforce the partnership. They included new countries, new partners countries, and they really try to align all the interests together. So it becomes more and more difficult to separate, on one hand, the EU, on the other hand, the US. And especially when you take into account criticism coming from Emmanuel Macron, who was saying that EU is not a priority for the US and it's just fine, but we need to understand that the EU needs to now build its own autonomy, to be autonomous in a way to approach this different situation. So yes, there is a feeling that in Europe that there is a need of much more autonomy, but in the same time, there is also a certain type of alignment with the US. I think that's why at the end people had the feeling, the question if there is really a political will within the EU to start to build that autonomy in terms of how to engage with China, how to engage with the rest of the world, not to see the world through the US worldview perspective.
Well, let's dive into this report, the EU and China in the Global South, Perspectives from African Countries. We're thrilled that we had the chance to speak with two of the authors of that report, Mariella di Ciommo, who is the Associate Director for ECDPM's Europe and Africa and the World Cluster, and Pauline Veron, who is a policy officer focusing on European foreign and development policy, as well as migration and mobility. I just also want to make sure we give a shout out to Nadia Ashraf, who's a policy officer at ECDPM, who contributed to the report but wasn't able to join us for the discussion that Géraud and I had with Mariella and Pauline. Mariella, Pauline, thank you both for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful to have you both. Congratulations on the report. It's a timely report because we're coming up on the one-year anniversary since the first Global Gateway Forum that took place last October in Brussels. And I think a good place for us to start before we dive into the details of the report and the 3 countries that you looked at and getting some of the feedback from European and local stakeholders in Africa about the Global Gateway might be to kind of refresh everybody as to what the Global Gateway actually is. So let me just start, before I get your take, Mariella and Pauline, on what it is, let me just give some of the official announcements that came between 21 and 23. This is the rollout of the ad that the European Union put to announce the Global Gateway, and this will give you a good sense of what they're trying to position.
The world needs investment, the right kind of investment, in quality infrastructure and skills, in local jobs. This is Europe's offer to the world. This is Global Gateway. 300 billion euros in investments that create strong and fair partnerships. On the 25th and 26th of October, President von der Leyen hosts the Global Gateway Forum, bringing together global leaders and businesses, debating solutions. Join us.
Sounds exciting. So that October reference that they made in the soundbite was President Ursula von der Leyen's address that she made at last October's first Global Gateway Forum. She covered a lot of territory in the forum, but for the purposes of our discussion and this report that we're going to talk about today, China did not come up specifically in von der Leyen's speech, but it's one of those kind of TikTok things where tell me you're talking about China without telling me you're talking about China.
Team Europe has put forward Europe's largest global investment program ever. As you know, we call it Global Gateway. It's a 300 billion euro program for financing and building clean infrastructure. And Global Gateway has the size to make a difference. Global Gateway, just as importantly, lays out a new approach to big infrastructure projects. For us, it's important that Global Gateway is about giving choices to countries, better choices. Because for many countries around the world, investment options are not only limited, but they all come with a lot of small print and sometimes with a very high price. Sometimes it is the environment that pays the price. Sometimes it is workers who are stripped of their rights. Sometimes foreign workers are brought in. And sometimes national sovereignty is compromised. No country should be faced with a situation in which the only option to finance its essential infrastructure is to sell its future.
So again, she did not mention China by name, but I think anybody who's been following the space knows very well that those alternatives that she was talking about, that grim alternative, was certainly in reference to China's Belt and Road Initiative and many of the criticisms that we've seen come out of Europe and the United States and India over the past 10 to 15 years. Mariella, let's start with you. There you heard Ursula von der Leyen, you heard the promo. You start your report by giving an update as to how the Global Gateway is doing. When we look at it now, 1 or 2 years into its nascent life, how is it doing? What is going on? What's the status of the Global Gateway? Just before we get into the details of how it's being perceived in Africa.
It's a very good question, and I think it's important to remember that Global Gateway is really a main strategy of the European Commission, which has a number of drivers, one of which is surely geopolitical and geoeconomic competition. But I think it also holds a bit of a desire and I hope an opportunity to innovate the way the Europe engage with international partners. And in fact, one of the important things that maybe would be interesting to mention now is that it is one of the initiatives that also in the political guidelines of the von der Leyen, so the future commission, is meant to be scaled up, if you like, to the next level. And this idea of Global Gateway being a comprehensive strategy where the EU offers investment, for sure, especially in infrastructure, but also in health, education and research, bringing together trade and macroeconomic support. So the idea is really to offer, if you like, a more integrated and a more comprehensive offer to partners. Of course, the focus is on Africa with half of the 300 billion that have been announced until 2027 to that continent. Where are we now? I think now Global Gateway, after now I think it's 3 years, is kind of picking up pace compared to the past. We see now that there are quite significant number of projects that are being implemented, especially in the area of connectivity and green energy. Climate and energy are a big area. So it's despite some of the, I would say, initial difficulties of moving forward with the project, this is a project which is going to gain scale and potentially a buy-in in the coming years. The buy-in has to come primarily internally. So one of the things that I feel has changed a bit in the last years is there was quite some skepticism within Europe whether Global Gateway would stay, what Global Gateway is, around the transparency and the accountability of Global Gateway. But these things I hope will be worked out, and we see more and more interest from the member states' side to engage with the initiative in the coming years. As we will explore in the podcast, I think all the discussion around how the Global Gateway is perceived outside of Europe is, I think, a bit more complex.
Mariella, before even going to how the Global Gateway is perceived outside Europe, you just mentioned the fact that it was like over its unfolding of Global Gateway, we had that sense of how the Global Gateway is perceived within Europe, within member country, within member state, within EU public servant, EU delegation. Do you believe that at this point today, there is a clear understanding of what Global Gateway is within Europe, actors and member country themselves? And by the same time, you can also tell us, so because many of our listeners, they hear about Global Gateway, they've heard about the PGI talking about the US initiative, they heard about so many of those initiatives that sometimes they get so mixed up in all of that. So in the same time, you can also allow us to understand what the Global Gateway is exactly. Maybe people will be able to understand it better along with, since we're moving to how it's perceived in different African countries as well.
So you're right, Christian Géraud, in the sense that Global Gateway has, I would say, quite a strong connection with the PGII initiative, and the original focus of the Global Gateway was and still is, in a way, raise investments on infrastructure. In the understanding, and I said there's a lot of data out there, that there is a big funding gap for infrastructure development across the globe. However, it is Europe. So as you know, we are 27 now, and there are, I would say, surely different understandings of what Global Gateway is, but also, if you allow me to say, some politics around it. So to make the initiative viable in the context of Europe, it has to be an initiative that has to reflect the different interests and also the different priorities of different member states of the EU, not only of the European Commission. So the European Commission has the not easy task to, if you like, bring together these different interests. So in this sense, I agree with you that Global Gateway is something different. And in a way, if you look at across time, Global Gateway has included health, education, and research. There is also a lot of discussion in Europe around how the EU values, or if you like, universal values, especially around sustainability, democracy, human rights, will be featured into the Global Gateway, whether areas that are important for European international engagement that are more related to the soft infrastructure, including human development, will be included either within the Global Gateway or as accompanying measures to it, or as areas that will be still visible and will have political traction and enough money in the future commission. So there is surely a lot of discussion on what Global Gateway is. But for me, the main point is this is a bit natural to the way the EU works. It ensures that the initiative is viable to begin with, and it's ultimately an initiative that it's going to stay. So the focus for me is also let's invest in making it, as good as it can be.
Pauline, Mariella talked about the complexities of any project in the European Union that involves 27 different countries. Back in April, the European Union's Commission, or the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships, that's an agency within the European Commission, issued a report that accused the Global Gateway of being spread too thinly. That's their quote. And it hasn't been as effective as it could be because it's lacking, that cohesion and that strategy. Do you agree, based on your research, on what that internal report said in terms of where we are? Because again, getting things done with 27 different countries is always going to be difficult. 300 billion is a very big number. The ambitions that Ursula von der Leyen laid out, particularly in reference to the Belt and Road Initiative, indirect, is huge. So when we think about the pulse check of where we are with the Global Gateway, Mariella has laid out quite a detailed plan, but then again, some internally within the European Commission, there seems to be some doubt.
No, that's a very good point. And I think that will be part of the challenge over the next few years, and the new European Commission will be to enhance the strategic focus of the Global Gateway and ensure that it's not trying to do too many things at the same time. Because I think that's been a bit of the challenge of new initiatives launched by the European institutions in recent years, is that they're trying to achieve too many goals. And as Mariella mentioned, the Global Gateway entails, addressing the digital transition, green transition, health, education, skills, all very important priorities, but it will need a bit of focus. And also, it's bringing many different actors together, be it development banks, operational agencies, development finance institutions, different actors within member states and within the EU institutions. So those actors will also have to be clear on what contribution they can bring to the Global Gateway. And I think that's part of the challenge also that Géraud was raising. It's the fact that, there are many actors to be brought together, many different objectives, and with the risk that actually at the end of the day, you don't have much impact because of the lack of strategic focus and steering. And I think that will also be linked, obviously, to who is leading that initiative. I think there's a very strong mandate for the new Commissioner for International Partnerships to, scale up the initiative. So I think with the strong strategic steering from that front, we might see a bit more clarity on what it's aiming to achieve. But it is a key, I think, a very key aspect for the next few years, precisely because of how it's being received by partner countries. If you don't have that strategic focus and steering, you run the risk of your partners not really understanding what the initiative is about. And the initiative was primarily about communication visibility and, enhancing the EU's profile in partner countries. So that will be a key challenge, I think, going forward.
So Mariella and Pauline, let's now dive into the report itself. And it's very fascinating read. It's very interesting because we do learn a lot of things based on different case studies that you've raised. But I want to start by just the basic point, like why did you choose those three countries? Why Morocco, South Africa, and DRC as to highlight the perspective on Global Gateway on the continent?
So maybe, Géraud, if I can, why we decided to do this work to begin with. We, of course, acknowledge, started from the fact that the geoeconomic and geopolitical competition are, especially vis-à-vis China, are a major driver of the global gateways. So we wanted also to somehow present how these dynamics may play in different contexts, or how they maybe more precisely influence the way the EU and the EU vis-à-vis China are perceived. So we chose these three countries because, first of all, to us, these were countries that were interesting from this perspective. Morocco is very close to Europe, is one of the countries which is playing quite well the geostrategic game. So that was, and it's an area where the EU invests heavily, in particular around energy through Global Gateway and through other measures in the country. And it's a country where China is also, investing more and more. In the DRC, as you know very well, it's one of the countries which sits maybe more uncomfortably than Morocco in geostrategic and geoeconomic competition because of the critical minerals and the big role and contribution that the country brings to the green transition. And finally, South Africa is a country where there is a big initiative of the EU, which is called the JETP, so the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is an initiative that aims to reduce emissions in some of the major emitters globally, where the EU is a major partner. So I think maybe two elements. One, how geoeconomic and geostrategic competition plays at the national level and how it played in different ways. That's one of the reasons why we chose the countries. And the other one is there a major engagement of the EU, in particular around green transition, understood in a very broad way in these contexts. And we wanted also to bring out a bit also how the national, regional dynamics play and question a bit the geostrategic angle in some cases.
Well, let's look at a little bit at the framing vis-a-vis China, and I'm going to read now from each of the countries the assessments, which I thought were so interesting because there was a lot of similarity. So in the DRC, you wrote, EU officials avoid juxtaposing the global gateway in the EU with the BRI and China's presence in the country because they consider this counterproductive. In Morocco, you wrote, competition with China is not a factor in the way the Global Gateway or the EU-Morocco Green Partnership are framed. And similarly, in South Africa, you guys said, competition with China does not appear to be a primary concern for EU officials, mainly because they assess that the BRI has a limited footprint in the country. And this is interesting to me, especially given what we heard from Ursula von der Leyen at the beginning, from her speech last year, at the beginning of our episode, how in many ways they're framing this against China when in fact on the ground in practice, China doesn't seem to be as big of a factor for EU officials and certainly for host governments that don't really want to be in the middle of a spitting match between the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Americans. And so I guess I'm curious, Pauline, to get your take on that apparent divergence between the framing of Global Gateway and the reality that you found on the ground in your research, where it's not as big an issue as many may suspect it is.
Yeah, indeed. That's a great question, Eric. And I think that's a bit of the core of the paper is the fact that there's a bit of a discrepancy between the narrative at headquarters level, where competition with China is very strong, as you rightly said, especially, recently with the recent announcement or statements by von der Leyen, and the country level, where there's, in a way, EU delegations have already moved on from that and understood that this is a counterproductive narrative and actually trying to find an alignment with national priorities and concerns is much more productive and much more fruitful in terms of the Global Gateway being a success at country level. So I think the different examples that you gave are right. I mean, Morocco is a country where there's already a strong, national green transition agenda, a very strong positioning of Morocco to attract investments in that field. And Morocco has very well understood also that its proximity with Europe and, access to the EU market can allow it to position itself as a sort of energy hub. There's now new initiatives around green hydrogen, for instance. So in a way, I mean, it's been quite easy for the EU to position not only the Global Gateway, but also particularly the green partnership that it has with Morocco in line with that already strong national agenda. DRC is a very different context, as you rightly, and on Morocco, I forgot to say an important point. As you said, I think China didn't really come up in the research and in the interviews, interestingly, even though it is a very important player in Morocco. We don't know. I mean, it's unclear whether it's a bit of a blind spot from EU actors in Morocco or just that because of that already strong partnership and alignment, other actors feature much less in the EU's thinking when it comes up with new initiatives. DRC is a very geopolitical case. As you know, I think there's with the strong focus on critical raw materials, the EU has tried to position the Global Gateway as a bit more of a comprehensive approach to local priorities, but it's been less successful, I think, than in Morocco because of the context. And their competition with China plays out a bit more. And in South Africa, again, there's strong attempts by the European Union and the European Union delegation to position the Just Energy Transition Partnership as a sort of response to domestically driven initiatives for a just transition in the country. It's been a bit less successful in Morocco because, again, of the local political and economic context. But there, again, I mean, competition with China is definitely not the center of the EU's narrative, but rather how the EU support contributes to South Africa's concerns and priorities, I would say.
It's interesting, Mariella, because as I was reading this, I was thinking about the discrepancies that exist in terms of the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen in particular, her tough line that she takes on China, and the approach that member states, so Germany and France in particular, Hungary is another example, have much more nuanced China policies. And so the European Union and the various member states are not always aligned when it comes to China. Olaf Scholz, for example, is desperately fighting to keep the European auto market alive in China, whereas Ursula von der Leyen and the others are talking about putting lots of sanctions and getting into a much more contentious relationship with China economically. It felt there was a little bit of that kind of one hand and the other hand not always aligned, reading your report as well about what was said about the Global Gateway and how it's being played out according to your research on the ground.
No, that is the case. And I found very interesting the way the EU delegations navigate, on one level, the headquartered narrative, and also the political direction under which they operate. but also are conscious and have to adapt in many ways to the local contexts. And I think one of the reasons why in the cases that we analyzed, the European delegations decided not to present the Global Gateway as an alternative to the BRI, is because they have understood that it is counterproductive. In a way, geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, so this framing of the Global Gateway as an option that partner countries have and as, in a way, a better option, if you like, compared to the BRI from the perspective of the European policymakers, speaks of a juxtaposition of instances that exist in the bilateral relationship between Europe and China, and if you like, we can put also the US into the picture, that partner countries don't necessarily have a bearing on. And while I think they welcome healthy competition, really don't want to be caught in a contraposition between these players or confrontation even. Having said that, we have to acknowledge, as you mentioned, today is a big day in the EU-China bilateral relationship because of the vote on the potential tariffs on the EV cars from China. The context is very, very tough. One level, there are economic issues, and the other level is the one with Ukraine. So, of course, from the perspective of the Ukraine war for the audiences, there is of course, a different positioning of China in relation to the Ukraine war, which Europe understands to be very close to Russia. So there is a multi-layer of factors that play into this discussion, and the EU delegations have to navigate, these different walls at the same time.
Pauline, when we look at those three countries and the framing that came out of the case studies of how they understand the Global Gateway and how the Global Gateway is either implemented or either how the EU is interacting through the Global Gateway with those three countries, I get the sentiment there was a clear three distinctive approach to the Global Gateway. And did you get the sense there is a clear understanding, just to get back to the first question I asked to Mariella now, to get back from an African perspective, have you get the sense there is a clear understanding from those three countries about what the Global Gateway is? And the second of all, just a sub-question to that, how much the Africa agenda, the Africa agency, those countries' agencies are playing into shaping the interaction between those three different countries and the EU into implementing the Global Gateway in their countries?
I think in terms of the three different approaches, you're totally right. And I think that's also linked to what I was explaining before, the different initiatives that were already, in some cases, existing in the countries before the Global Gateway. So in the case of Morocco, it's the Green Partnership. In the case of South Africa, it's the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So I think there was that has now been subsumed or is part of the Global Gateway. I think there's some ongoing partnerships and green transition initiatives in those countries. And then the Global Gateway came and had to adapt also to some extent to what was already existing and to, also more broadly tailor to the local political and economic context. So definitely, I think there are different approaches, which I think is a good thing, to be honest, because the Global Gateway at the end of the day will have to be adapted to the local context. So that's the first thing. And I think linked to that, your second question on the clear understanding, I think generally there wasn't a very clear understanding of what the Global Gateway is in the countries that we looked at, partly again linked to the fact that there are so many different initiatives, even just in the field of the green transition, not even mentioning more generally from the EU. So in many cases, you see a bit of confusion from partners on, what is the Global Gateway in comparison with the other partnerships existing? So there's a bit of lack of communication or miscommunications on what the Global Gateway actually adds to these initiatives and what it is. That's definitely a recurring finding across the case studies. It is what it is, how much money is it, what is it trying to achieve. And we've seen some sort of communication efforts from the EU delegations to try to improve that understanding, but I think we're not there yet. And it could be argued that in many cases, China is actually better at articulating what it brings to those countries, but we can come back to that. And I think to your last question on African agency, that's also something that we try to we try to highlight throughout our work is the fact that it's in many cases it is still lacking to some extent in terms of consultations with partners, responsiveness to local agendas. I think there's really, as I said, an effort to tailor the Global Gateway to national priorities, but in many cases it is still a new initiative that wasn't necessarily consulted enough, or, that in some cases is not seen as responsive enough to local agendas and the way the green transition is seen in those countries, as I mentioned with South Africa before. So that's still, again, an important point for improvement that we highlighted in the paper, I think.
When you look at some of the conclusions and the recommendations that you included in the report, a lot of the focus comes back to China. You wrote that while the EU sees China's role in the Global South through the lens of a zero-sum game, partner countries want to keep their options open. You also went on to say the EU should continue to strengthen its own offer rather than focus on displacing China. And that just got me thinking that, maybe for political reasons domestically, they have to frame this as against China. And that's how you get $300 billion of money approved by policymakers in Europe that oftentimes are very skeptical of China. But the reality is it looks like, based on what you're saying in your research, is that the efforts of the Global Gateway in many ways are complementary. It's not a choice of either China or Europe, but in many ways, they're actually working together. And you even heard from some of the EU folks on the ground that they would like to work with the Chinese. And they've made some outreaches to the Chinese, and the Chinese haven't responded, not surprisingly. That's another issue. But it just feels, again, what a waste of effort and energy to frame this in a geopolitical competition when, in fact, it really is about complementary development initiatives that can benefit partner countries. Mariella, I'd like to get your take on that.
Absolutely. There are other logics that play out at the national context. And I think for me, the bottom line is that African countries definitely welcome competition, especially because it strengthens, as we also highlight in the report, their bargaining power. So they can get better deals from European member states, from the EU, from China, as much as from others, if they have more options. So this is definitely a development that they welcome, but they definitely don't want to be caught up in a geopolitical mess. This is very clear. And what we also heard is that, cooperation is an option, for example, cooperation between China and the EU in some cases, but then it has to happen on partner countries' term. They have to dictate the agenda and also when this cooperation can happen and when that shouldn't happen. And maybe the third point is when we talk about cooperation, I think many of us start thinking, for example, at very formalized elements like trilateral cooperation, for example, while we find that in a way more flexibility and more pragmatism can work better. So working around agendas that can be shared, for example, improving environmental, social, and governance standards in some cases, or finding synergies or complementarities, as you rightly say. I think the case of the DRC is one of those in which, for example, through the interviews, we heard, China, it's why would you focus on displacing Chinese investments in the mining sector? What you have to do is actually to improve, the standards that they follow, because these are important to improve the living standards of the Democratic Republic of Congo populations. But the EU could invest, for example, in green energy for industrial production, and the focus has to be on supporting local production of critical minerals for the DRC. So in a way, why would you focus on the political and geopolitical competition between these two countries, while there is a name, which is a very good aim that the DRC wants to push and from which both the EU and China could benefit in the end? There are other examples and other opportunities of potential exploring synergies and complementarities or even cooperation, for example, working through intermediaries, through multilateral organization. We found the case in South Africa through multilateral, through banks, especially development banks, or through the EU member states. So I think we have to keep our minds open in that regard. I think this is also one of the key messages of our report.
Pauline, do you get the sense that that message of keeping the mind open and maybe thinking about considering cooperation with China in different countries under the global gateway, do you get the sense that that message is heard, understood from the European Commission in Brussels? Because sometimes when reading through the report, we realized that there was sometimes discrepancies of what the EU delegation on those partner countries were thinking, understanding and communicating and the feeling they had compared to what was felt and also communicate in Brussels. Do you have that? There is that sense that maybe cooperation can be considered with China in those countries?
No, I think we're not there yet. And I think that's partly why we wanted to do this research, right? The discussion is extremely polarized at the moment, especially in Brussels. I think it's a very black and white discussion. And Mariella also highlighted the broader context. I think whatever the EU does in those countries has to be seen also in the broader geopolitical context of other issues between the EU and China. And I think that's, we're not yet at the moment where, or it is difficult at least to bring up those discussions and the discussion about potential cooperation and the fact that there are many middle options in between cooperation and competition. So I think our research was really to start a frank and open discussion on this and to bring a bit some evidence back to Brussels that, African governments are not being taken advantage of by China. And they do see it as a sort of win-win situation to be able to pick and choose what the EU and China bring in terms of assets in the different countries. So, I hope that the evidence that we brought from the three countries also, contributes to that reflection in Brussels.
I couldn't help but smile at the end of the report with one of your recommendations, and we'll close our discussion here. You said there seems to be a knowledge gap among European actors on how to engage with China and its presence in the global south. The EU has made some investments in improving its understanding of China's presence in the global south. It's certainly worth investing more in this area in the future. And of course, I couldn't help but smile thinking to myself, well, I know a great way they can improve their knowledge of what China's doing in the global south. www.chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. But let's talk about that knowledge gap a little bit and how much is that contributing to the misframing or some of the difficulties that they're facing. And I'd like to get both of you to give your take on that. Mariella, let's start with you.
Yeah, maybe, Eric, going back to your point of some interest that you made before, now of some interest from European actors in working with China. One of the bottlenecks that we found there is that they didn't really know how to engage. I mean, they didn't get a response. That's one issue. But they didn't really have a clear idea what China does or how China different. The multiplicity of Chinese actors that exists on the ground operate. So there is that, I would say, more micro-level understanding that has to be improved. There is also, because the discussion is very polarized, it's also difficult to have a nuanced view of what China does in these countries. So what Pauline said. So when we move to the EU headquarters, one of the, what we see is that because the discussion is very polarized, then bringing out the contributions that China brings to the development of African countries in particular is sometimes very difficult. So you find that the discussion is very focused on the shortcomings of Chinese presence, especially around the values agenda. So how China, for example, engages with autocratic regimes, or the fact that the social standards and environmental standards of its projects are not up to what Europe would do. So, and this is not necessarily false, but the discussion has to be nuanced, and you have to recognize that actually China also brings contributions. So in terms of, for example, the processing of minerals is an important element and has made that option possible in the case of the DRC. The situation of enlarging the scope of options for partner countries, bringing in more resources for infrastructure development, which is an area where Europeans have not been operating for a very long time, and other contributions that we highlight in the report. I also feel that if we had a more open discussion, then Europe could also look at how to improve its own offer. One of the key points we hear from partner countries is this idea of the slow delivery of Europe and the quick delivery of China. This is something that the EU Commission, I understand, wants to invest more going forward. And can we learn from China in that space as well? So there are a number of spaces where Europe could actually learn more about China and also use that knowledge to reflect on itself.
And Pauline, let's give you the last word in terms of those knowledge gaps that you mentioned in the report and the learnings that Mariella was talking about, what needs to be done going forward.
Thanks. 2 points I want to highlight. The first one is indeed it was quite striking to us to see that in some countries where the Chinese presence has been growing in recent years, actually EU officials in those countries didn't necessarily have if they weren't focusing on China specifically, they didn't have an overview of that or a clear understanding of that. So I think that's an important knowledge gap to be filled. And I think your podcast is a great source of information in general on all things China. And the second one is also a point that we make in the report is the fact that there are other actors than China, right? The geopolitical environment is not just defined by China. And in some countries, the Gulf states or Turkey or other actors actually have sometimes more presence than China. So I think that very narrow vision of the geopolitical environment and competition can also, dismiss other actors that are also very important in the current context. So yeah, I think there's a need for more honesty, for more openness, and definitely more, knowledge on China and the other actors.
The report is The EU and China in the Global South, Perspectives from African Countries. Mariella de Ciommo, who's the Associate Director of ECDPM's Europe and Africa and the World Cluster, along with Pauline Veron, who's a Policy Officer at ECDPM, focusing on European foreign and development policy, migration, and mobility. And I want to give credit to your colleague Nadia Ashraf, who is also a Policy Officer there, for writing such an excellent report, really thoughtful, multifaceted, and well-rounded. And we will put a link to it in the show notes so everybody can read it and download it and share their comments on it. So Mariella and Pauline, thank you so much for your time today and for shedding light on this important issue.
Thanks to you, and well done for the excellent podcast you run.
Thanks both for the great conversation.
Géraud, what I liked most about the report and what Mariella and Pauline were saying is how they were challenging so much of the conventional wisdom that this is very much a zero-sum competition among the United States, Europe, and China. And remember, PGII is very much a joint European-US undertaking. And so even the Libido Corridor that we've been talking a lot about in recent weeks and months is also part of a European-US initiative. There's a lot of European engagement there. And yet, when you talk to people on the ground, and this is what you and I have seen in our dealings with EU officials on the ground, and what the research seems to bear out as well, is they don't see it in anywhere near as binary terms. And that's in part because they're getting feedback from their host country counterparts to say, we don't want this to be a either or, we want it to be a both and. And that is something that I think is lost in so much of the public discourse about what the Chinese are doing in Africa today.
Yes, definitely. It speaks about the certain sense of deafness that you do have in many capitals in the global north, EU and G7 country, where the understanding of what China does in Africa is just not there. The understanding of how China is perceived by those host countries is just not there. And they put in place project with narrative that seems to come with the savior complex, that we are coming to save you from the big China danger. I'm thinking here of Ursula von der Leyen speech, and we are coming to save you, we are coming to give you better options. And when they got on the ground, they realized that people, they're listening, they say, we still don't see and you still don't know what you're talking about when you talk about big danger. And we've seen that in a country like the DRC, in the reports where the interviews reveal that people are saying that the way they're portraying China, we don't see that here. Of course, we see there is room for improvement. Definitely there are, but we are way far away from what they're painting the situation here on the ground. So yes, that speaks a lot about how sometimes those projects are designed in an office somewhere in Brussels or Washington, D.C. without really taking into account the agency of African countries, because there is also that sense Africa don't have agency. Africans, they don't know what they're doing. So we have to provide them with the tools to better understand what they're up against. And we are there to help them to do so. And this is where I think they're going to keep on failing and failing badly, because once they're going to realize that people are just not dancing to that song anymore, it's going to be difficult for them to be able to counter China, especially when there's even no place to do that. Maybe there are places for cooperation, but since they framed everything under the spectrum of us against them, I think they're stripping themselves away from options that can allow them to reach their goals and interest as well.
Yeah, but let's be fair here, because the Chinese are also complicit in all of this. You hear the Chinese whining and whining and whining about how the West, the US and Europe, are constantly using zero-sum thinking and zero-sum politics. And yet, we've seen in this report, and again, we've heard it from a lot of the sources we've talked to, that when outreach is made to the Chinese, whether it's Chinese state-owned enterprises from civil society actors, or whether it's government to government between EU and host governments, there's no answer. And that is endlessly frustrating, because at the end of the day, if the Chinese say they don't want as combative a relationship with the West, and yet they won't talk, and they hide behind the walls of their embassies or their state-owned enterprises and just shut out the world and basically only want to be in environments that are very controlled and self-contained and have to go back to Beijing for all of the direction and the guidance, and there's this risk aversion in terms of dealing with foreign, and I don't even think it's just the West. I think if Japanese or other foreign stakeholders came, the Chinese are like, oh, no. And so at the end of the day, I think there's more to it than just the US and Europe. In this case, Europe is getting it all wrong and messing it all up. But I was very encouraged to see in the report that they're making outreach to the Chinese, even if the Chinese are not responding.
Two things here. First of all, is like, I'm going to be the devil advocate here. The first point will be, how would you expect the Chinese to react in a context where the messaging is not clear? How do you want a Chinese embassy or Chinese company to react when the EU delegation can say something on the ground, but Ursula von der Leyen is saying something else in Brussels?
Yeah, but that's the way that politics always is. But
This is the problem. This is how politics is made in the US and Europe, because...
It is, but you could say the same thing. But Géraud, you can say the same thing about Xi Jinping and Wang Yi, say horrible things about the US and Europe, but that doesn't stop peer officers, foreign service officers, one from the European Union, a political attaché from the European Union, and one from China, to get together and to have a conversation and to find ways to collaborate together.
But the thing is, the reality is, like, when the Chinese, I don't know if you have an instance of that one, the Chinese ambassador saying something in one capital city elsewhere in the world, and Wang Yi saying something and Xi Jinping saying something else. Here in the EU is quite common. And the report says that you're going to have something that the EU delegation will say something, and when you move forward in Brussels, it's the same part of the same organization, but you're hearing a different messaging. And you move up the ladder, Ursula von der Leyen is also saying the same thing. And you go even now further, member countries are also saying something else. So from the same block of countries, for the same initiative, you have 3-4 different rhetoric around the same country. So once now one of them is approaching a Chinese company or a Chinese embassy, the question would become, who do you want them to believe? You want them to believe what the ambassador is saying in the same time, or believing what the member country are saying, or what the EU delegation are saying. So it's that part of the complexity that makes the EU, and not only the EU, but I think the Western or bloc countries negotiating with China, because the reality when it comes to the cultural differences, like China is a country where you have the state dictates. When the state says something, when an ambassador says something, is speaking, and you pretty much sure that there will be no contradictory messages coming from his own bosses, which is not the case in many countries where you have so many actors shaping the narrative, shaping the conversation. At the end, you kind of wonder, if somebody's telling me something here, who am I to believe? And worse of it is like they can all be members within the same executive branch. We can pretend that, the executive is saying something, the legislative branch is saying something else in the case of the US. But in the EU, for example, you have all people in the same branch, within the same branch of the same organization, around the same initiative, you have 4-5 different narratives. At the end, you cannot blame someone and say, I cannot cooperate with you because I don't know what I should be believing here. I don't know how I should be cooperating here because you're not telling me clear messages in here.
Listen, I think you can separate politics from pragmatic cooperation. And we have examples of this. I mean, let's talk about the French. That the French have been very critical of China on Xinjiang, on human rights policies, on Tibet. Now, even on the South China Sea, there's French warships that are part of the coalition in the South China Sea. And yet, Xi Jinping and Emmanuel Macron agreed to 7 development initiatives in Africa. Total Energies and CNOOC are participating on the East Africa crude oil pipeline. We talked about the port of Lekki. That is another example of French-Chinese collaboration, state enterprises working together. It can happen. So this very simple question of, well, at the top level, they're spitting at each other. Yeah, they all are, of course. But that doesn't mean that at the mid-operating level, collaborative cooperation can't happen. We saw also just earlier this year, there was a fantastic photo posted on the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania's X feed welcoming the Chinese ambassador and some of her colleagues to dinner. And they said, thank you very much for having a wonderful dinner together. This is what diplomats are supposed to do. They're supposed to have these engagements.
I agree with you, and you're totally right. But the example you've given are the example where engagements happen on the higher levels. But in the case of the report, the engagement did not happen in the higher levels. So you cannot be blaming people on the lower level.
It can't happen if nobody answers the phone. I mean, the Chinese weren't even answering the phone. So it can't even happen if then. That's the problem.
Yes, but you cannot blame them in the same time not wanting effort. You and I have been covering these China stories for so long, and we've heard so many times how the Chinese are afraid of how many times what they say have been misconstrued by the media on one side. So now you have here media, civil society organization, politicians on the lower level having different narrative. And very obvious, I say, I'm really going to sound really Chinese, China advocacy here. But that's the reality of the complexity of the part of where even the report, they say there is a lack of understanding on both sides. And this is the reality of how the EU or the Europe or even Africa is engaging with China. We seems not to understand how to engage with China properly. And because we don't know how to engage with them, every silence, every non-response is perceived as like a rejection, whereas we just don't know how to talk with them. And
fair enough.
As you mentioned, those cases of Total, of Olaf Scholz, proves you that there is a level of engagement that can make cooperation happen. But somehow, in certain areas, we still don't find the right keys, the right ways to do that.
And I think the point that you're making is very, very important in terms of these knowledge gaps that we keep seeing come up. And again, we've talked about the China literacy problem in many African governments, including your own in Kinshasa, but this thing keeps coming up over and over in Europe as well. So huge knowledge gaps, and the fact that a mainstream, very well-known think tank like ECDPM concludes this report by saying knowledge gaps are the problem is absolutely, just to me, very revealing. That it also might be that the reason why they're not answering the phone is they're not calling the right number. And I mean that in terms of they're not approaching the right way. They don't know how to approach the right people. They don't have the relationships. And so if you just kind of call the front desk and you're not going to get a response, or you call the wrong person under the wrong, context and pretext, well, of course, nothing's going to go. And if you don't have that knowledge and those relationships, they say in Chinese, 关系很重要. Relationships are very important. And relationships start with having a cup of tea with somebody, meeting for coffee, getting to know, building trust. And maybe that trust isn't there when those calls are being made, which is why, again, I wasn't being self-serving when I was saying they should subscribe to us, but at the end of the day, they really should, only because there are not a lot of sources out there that focus on what China's doing in the global south. And again, this is going to sound like a commercial for us. I felt like I could use that copy as part of our marketing. Do you know what I mean? Like this is it. This is the reason why you need to follow people like you, Géraud. Every day from morning to night, just think about this topic. And so your insights and Cobus's insights and Johnny's insights and Antonia in Jakarta and Lucy in Taipei, this team of people are thinking about this. The fact is, not a lot of other people in the world have dedicated their lives to thinking about what the Chinese are doing in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. You will get analysts at think tanks like ECDPM or at Brookings Institute or at ISEAS in Singapore who think about it piecemeal. So, at ISEAS in Singapore, they'll think about it in the context of Southeast Asia, but they won't think about it in a more global context. That's not a criticism in any way, but it's just the reality of it. And so I think these knowledge gaps may be a big source of the problem on both sides, because I will tell you that the Chinese have massive knowledge gaps of their own, massive knowledge gaps. And they have a same problem with, as well. They don't have a China Global South project that is doing this in Chinese every day and giving what we think are fact-based kind of nonpartisan analysis. And that may be the source of the problem. And so that's why this report that the three did, I think, is really essential reading. I mean, let me give you the last word.
Oh, yes, definitely. As you said, this report is it's a must read, and I recommend you're going to find out a lot of things. You're going to learn a lot about the dynamics and what you see on the ground, especially in those countries where you realize that when the EU delegations are coming, talking with them with a certain mindset, and the reaction they get from most countries like, oh, I didn't know that for you that was not priority. We understand that this was a different priority for you. And if you really understand how the Global Gateway is and how it's working, how it's going to unfold in the coming years in those countries, I would definitely advise you to read the report. You're going to learn a lot, and we're going to have them on the French podcast on Afrique Chine, where you're going to talk about it in French. So people in the DRC, in Morocco, we covered 2 French-speaking countries. You're going to learn as well what that global gateway is and what are the challenges they're meeting on the ground.
And that's the work that we do at the China Global South Project in French, in English, and in Arabic as well. We have dreams in the future of launching a Spanish language edition, hopefully in the next year or two. But the goal is to further this conversation about what the Chinese are doing in the Global South to close those knowledge gaps that were identified in this report. If you would like to see the work that Géraud and the team are doing, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable, starting at $19 a month. And we have a student and teacher discount. So if you are at a university or a school, a high school, for example, we have quite a few high school students who are following us, send me an email, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for half off discounts. So Géraud and I will be back again next week, along with Cobus van Staden. So for Géraud and Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.